We're going to continue the battle spreadsheet with battles from Gettysburg in July of 1863 all the way to the end of the war and the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in the spring of 1865. So the Battle of Gettysburg, obviously being here in Pennsylvania, we know it hopefully a little bit better than most people. And it is a cataclysmic battle. It is the turning point of the war. It is a lot of things. So let's get into it. So some important facts, as we should fill out on our sheet, is basically who is leading the North at this point. And right now, the Union general has been changed from Joseph Hooker, who was in command, to a man by the name of George Meade. Here's George Meade. The Confederates, of course, are Robert E. Lee. He is commanding the Army of Northern Virginia. And as the Confederates had done before, they're changing their tactics, and they are going to hopefully invade the North and try and bring a close to this war. They had won at Chancellorsville, they had won at Second Manassas, and so now they feel that the momentum is on their side, and this could be the knockout punch. It is the largest battle of the entire war, with two sides combined with about 150,000. And you can also see the dates here are the summer of July of 1863. It is a 3-day battle that takes place. The reason for it is that the first day is pretty much won by the Confederates as they kind of bump into Union cavalry north and west of the town. Then both sides decide that this is the place they want to sort of give battle and fight each other out. And the South, of course, pushes the North through the town into kind of a little fishhook south of town, and that's where the next 2 days of the battle occur. As stated, it is the turning point battle of the war. This is the war that, in the battle, that could really have shifted things if the Confederates could have been able to capture or defeat the Union and then move on to Harrisburg, which was their true objective, and then capture a northern city. They could have pushed the Union to basically sue for peace. It's also the bloodiest battle of the entire war. 50,000 total casualties. You're talking about around 7,000 dead. The remainder are split between wounded and captured or killed or missing. And so this is the worst battle overall. Now, of course, some people think of Antietam. That's a single day. This is a 3-day battle, so that's why it gets that. And last but not least, it is really the first major Union victory in the East, with the Army of the Potomac. Something to add to your sheet on the area of important people and important events, obviously, is the last day of the battle. This is the day of Pickett's charge. So Pickett, here he is, George Pickett, named for the man who was the largest contingent of the charge were his Virginians, and that's why it gets the name Pickett's charge, even though here there was a person above him directing him. James Longstreet was his name. It gets the name of Pickett's charge. So what it was on the 3rd of July, Lee had decided that the previous day he had attacked the ends down here at Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. For those of you who've ever climbed over the rocks of Devil's Den and Little Round Top and Big Round Top, that had been pushed back, and so he felt that on the 3rd day that the Union here in Cemetery Ridge was very weak, and that's where he was going to force this major attack and charge. So the numbers change from 12 to as many as 15,000 Confederates make the charge across this wide and open field. Now, it doesn't look very far here, but this is about a mile of open ground. And so on the afternoon of the 3rd of July in 1863, after a huge bombardment, Pickett and the rest of his men under his command step out and make this charge across this wide and open space. The lines here run almost a mile from the beginning of his lines to the end of his lines. So it's a mile this way and it's a mile across to get over to Union lines. The problem is once they step out, they're under constant artillery fire and rifle fire, and basically Confederate casualties run as high as 50% do not come back after the charge. So anywhere from 6,000 to 7,000 are either killed, wounded, or captured on the 3rd day. And this is nothing like the events at Antietam where it's a draw. This is clearly a huge and massive Confederate defeat on Union soil. The idea that the Union does hold, the Confederates retreat the following day, and within a few days they're able to cross through Gettysburg or through Maryland and into the safety of Northern Virginia, which of course angers Lincoln that Meade does not finish up this victory and crush Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. We're now done with Gettysburg. Lee, like I said, retreats, and now we move to the next event, which is the fall of Vicksburg, which just happens to be the very next day. So more than 800 miles away down in Mississippi, the area of Vicksburg, Mississippi, is under now Union control. So if we look at a map, you can sort of see right here when we're talking about the Mississippi River as it goes down, this was a vital artery in the Confederate war effort. And so what the Union was attempting to do is move down and control more and more of the river. And General Grant is in charge of trying to bring it under control. And so for the past several weeks, he has been trying to assault Vicksburg from one side. And then what he does is he actually goes over and south of the river, comes back and actually attacks Vicksburg from the other side. And he is able to lay siege to the city and eventually force its surrender on the 4th of July, 1863. So he's the victorious commander. He's now had 2 major victories in the West. He's had Shiloh. He's had now Vicksburg. The Union now controls all of the Mississippi River as it goes down through New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and it cuts off the western part of the Confederacy. It cuts out, of course, all the idea of the movement of traffic up and down it over into the western portions. So it's a very crucial point when Vicksburg falls to the Union. On a side note, the people of Vicksburg were so upset that they surrendered on that day that supposedly they do not celebrate the 4th of July for a very long period of time. I think it's more than 50 years following it. I don't think they actually start doing it until after the Second World War. So it's not in there, but I got to stop here and talk about a famous event that happens in the fall of 1863, and that would, of course, be when Lincoln comes to Gettysburg and he gives the famous Gettysburg Address. Now, the reason why he's in Gettysburg is that they have decided about 5 months later, after the events at Gettysburg of how terrible it was, that it would be an awesome and great place to have a national cemetery dedicated to the Union dead. And so kids always ask the question, why is the speech so important? Well, the speech is important because, it's a short speech. It's less than 3 minutes long. And I'll have some videos down, and I'd really like you to watch them. They're very short. He tells us why the war was important in 10 sentences. He tells us in a short period of time why the war is important, and more importantly, why does the Union need to win it? Because he has this opportunity to speak to pretty much a nation in some ways that would read his remarks in a newspaper about the commitment to continue the struggle to bring the country back together by defeating the Confederate forces and continuing this war. And so, as you all would know, he starts off with the 407 years ago. And what this is, it's a reference, folks. It's a reference to a date in history. And so, as he says, 407 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And if you do the numbers, a score is 20 years. So 4 is 80 plus 7. 87 years before 1863 would be the date of 1776. So it is a reference to the publication and the passing of the Declaration of Independence, and saying how much that changed the history of the world. Now, when he was there, this was the main speaker. His name was Edward Everett, and this is what he said. I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came near to the central idea in 2 hours, because he did speak for 2 hours, as you did in 2 minutes. Now, you would think that such a historic occasion, and there were photographers there, that we would get some kind of photographic evidence of Lincoln giving one of the most famous speeches in all of American history. But sadly, we do not. So the photographer there only captures this photo. And I kind of highlighted there. You see that guy? That would be Lincoln going back to his seat after giving the address. So the person who was in charge of actually snapping the picture assumed that the president would go on for some period of time. He did not. And this is all we have from it. Now, Grant gets the promotion. He is taken out of the West, and he is put into new command of the general in charge of all Union armies, and he comes east, and it will be from this spring of 1864 to the spring of 1865, where he will confront Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia with his main army, the Army of the Potomac. So the next battles that we talk about are a series of battles that occur in the spring and the summer of 1864 in Northern Virginia. And so they're known as the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, yes, that's the name of the town, and Cold Harbor. So things to know, they occur over several weeks. Most of them are draws or Confederate victories because they are able to turn back the Union onslaught, who is attempting to reach Richmond and crush the Confederate government and end the war. What it also does is it racks up a tremendous amount of casualties. 60,000 casualties are brought up by Grant in a short period of time, and so the rumors of him and the accusations of him being a butcher come out again. So the next thing is, one of the last parts that he does in the summer of 1864 is he lays siege. Remember, that's surrounding your enemy and just basically trying to constrict and cut off all forms of communication and supply. And this siege, begun in the late summer of 64, is going to go all the way until the spring of 1865 and be the last main battle of the entire war. So the next map that I'm going to show you just shows it on a map to sort of see how Grant is attempting to get around Lee's, what we say, right flank. So this is his right flank, this is his left flank. And so what Lee's job is to stay between Grant and Richmond, okay, where Richmond is here. So he's always trying to block the movement of the Union forces, and that's what you're seeing here. So that's the Wilderness. This is Spotsylvania Courthouse. You should have the arrow go further over here. You can sort of see it kind of. And then you have the Battle of Cold Harbor over this way. So the idea of all of these are just terrible battles where Grant loses large numbers and the Confederates do as well. The difference is that the Union can sort of replace some of those with conscripts, whereas the Confederates cannot. And then eventually what he's going to try and do is make its way down here to Petersburg and lay siege to that. So the Union's going to be attempting to get around Confederate lines, and Confederate lines are going to be attempting to just string this out. So meanwhile, back in the West, the army that he had left behind, William Tecumseh Sherman is the now new leader of that army in the West. And so he's going to strike out from Mississippi and basically take care of some areas in Georgia. He seizes Atlanta in the fall of 1864 after heavy fought battles north and west of the city. He seizes Atlanta, stays there a few days and weeks maybe, and then burns it to the ground as he leaves, which of course was just shocking to its residents. His forces, now 60,000 strong, decide to set out for the coast, marching without supplies given to them. Basically, they're going to live off the land, and this is going to be his historic march to the sea. So, let's talk about that. So his march to the sea is going to go from Atlanta to Savannah and be over about 2.5 months long. And in that, he is not going to fight any battles. There are no troops between him and Savannah. And so what he's attempting to do, as he said, is bring the hard, cold hand of war to the residents of the Deep South and the Confederacy, basically showing them that the enemy, the Union, can march unopposed throughout the entire heartland of your country. Eventually what he does is he gets there to Savannah. The city leaders go out and surrender the city, and it is so pretty that he decides to not burn it to the ground, but yet offer it as a Christmas gift to the President of the United States, because here is his telegram: Savannah, December 22nd, to His Excellency President Lincoln. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also 25,000 bales of cotton. W.T. Sherman, Major General. So, Savannah is a beautiful, beautiful city. If anybody's ever seen Forrest Gump, the idea of Forrest Gump is sitting on a bench, and that bench is located in the city of Savannah. Beautiful city of parks. After he captures Savannah, stays there a while, he's going to set out north from Savannah, as you can sort of see, march north into and destroying much of South Carolina's interior farms, burns the capital of Columbia. Remember, he thinks of South Carolina as the place that started it all. And then he's going into North Carolina, going after the next army that's actually in western North Carolina, trying to bring this war to a close. The next slide will show you those various battles we already talked about. So here you can sort of see the battles between Lee and Grant here in Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and again you see those blue arrows always trying to get around Lee, and eventually he swings south and lays siege to Petersburg right here. Okay, so the siege at Petersburg is going to last 9 months. They are locked in this endurance struggle of which side can basically outlast the others, but this is that last rail junction before Richmond. So Lee must hold or Richmond will fall. Down here you also see an interesting thing I told in class about the Battle of the Crater, and that was actually done by people from this state. The people from Pennsylvania, we had some coal miners that decided that there were Confederate lines and that there were Union lines. And to break through the Confederate lines, the Union coal miners decided, hey, we want to build a huge tunnel down a shaft tunnel into the middle between the no man land between the two sides and blow it up. And that's exactly what they did in the summer of 1864. The problem was it was poorly executed. The Confederates were dazed and confused. Many were killed. But eventually, as the Union tries to cross into Confederate lines, they rush into the crater. And when they get to the other side, they realize they can't really make it out. And so many troops are actually shot and killed. Many of them are actually what they would refer to as colored troops made the assault, and the Confederates rally and basically turn back an assault by the Union at that Battle of the Crater. So when we talk about the Battle of Petersburg, what you should have down is obviously the dates. So they would go from the summer of 64 to the spring of 65. And they're going to also, you should have down that it is the last battle of the war. It is a siege. And one more thing to add, and that is basically seeing trench warfare being used. So you can sort of see these guys are obviously down here in this like depression area, and then you have the officers up here. So the point is, this will foreshadow what's going to happen in the war in the 20th century, where troops are no longer going to, stand on open fields and kind of fire back and forth. They are going to entrench themselves, dig trenches to protect their men from enemy fire, enemy artillery, and wait there to basically move out. So this is going to be what's going to happen when we start talking next year about the trench warfare of World War I. Also with that, you can sort of see here is that trenches are interesting, but these are very much wound down and eroded. But they're also open to soldiers running through and into the trenches. And so what happened was they had to come up with these devices. Now, this is a French one. I can't remember the term. But basically, this is the forerunner before barbed wire. So this was supposed to stop frontal assaults. Now, no, it's not meant to have people like literally run into them and, get shish kebab. It's meant to slow them down enough that somebody that's in the trench can shoot them. And that's basically what barbed wire is around, too. It's supposed to slow you down. Infantry assaults, those type of things, to distract infantry soldiers as they make assaults. Now what happens eventually is that Lee realizes his case is almost terminal to the point where he cannot keep staying in Petersburg. He has to link up with a larger army, but if he leaves Petersburg and abandons the defenses there, he realizes that the war and the city of Richmond are going to basically fall to the Yankees, to the Union. But that's what he decides to do in early April. He tells Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, I am taking the Army of Northern Virginia and moving west. And so that's what happens here. So on April 2nd, 1865, he flees west, and you can sort of see the fall of Richmond, night of April 2nd. So Petersburg falls to the Union because the Union are able to basically move into abandoned earthworks of the Confederacy. And since they're able to take these abandoned areas south of the city of Petersburg, they can then move and take Richmond the following day. So that's what you're seeing here. Jefferson Davis and much of the Confederate cabinet do make it out of the city before the Union troops arrive. But what you're seeing here are civilians trying to make it out of Richmond. In the background, you clearly see that there are explosions going off. There's fires. They tried to burn military stores, and basically the fire got away from it and burned about a third of the city was burned. And so what happened is the Southerners themselves flee Richmond, and yet Lee flees westward with his army. So let me show you that on a new slide. On the 4th, the next day, Lincoln actually comes down and visits the enemy capital, and in the background you can sort of still see smoking ruins in the background. But he's greeted in some ways as a conquering hero, especially by African Americans who look at him as how their lives are going to change because of the end of this war. But if you look here, these were those battles that we had talked about, and then down here you can see Petersburg. But you can also see this dotted line right here, and that is the Army of Northern Virginia fleeing away from Petersburg and trying to get to Western Virginia. What the Union's going to do is basically pursue them. And that's what you see on this slide right here. The various days over the next 4 to 5 days, the Union are just harassing and trying to get in front of Lee's retreat and eventually cut him off. And that's eventually what happens right here. You see it. The Union cuts in front, stops him, and the two leaders begin to actually speak with messages. And so you have General Lee getting this message from General Grant saying the results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance. I'm asking you for the surrender of the portion of the Confederate States Army. That's at 5 p.m. on April 7th. Lee responds late that night, say, I reciprocate, I agree. Your desire, I approve of your desire to avoid the useless effusion of blood. What that means is, if we fight, you know and I know that we could fight and soldiers will die, people will be wounded, but there is obviously no question of what the outcome will be. So he says, I ask you for the terms of surrender. And so what happens is, within a day, they find this location, and that is then the following day, on April 9th, this home known as the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, and that's the name of the village. This is the place where the two men will meet in the parlor and work out the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia to the Army of the Potomac. So this happens on April 9th in the afternoon. Lee says there's nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths. He's dressed in his best uniform because he believes himself to become a prisoner of General Grant. That does not happen. They sign papers within about 60 minutes to an hour and a half. This is General Grant's staff in the background, but they basically say goodbye. Lee is allowed to go back to his men and tell them surrender. They go through the surrender process of turning in their weapons, and that is the way this ends. The Union, of course, starts firing off guns and artillery, and Grant is rumored to have basically said, stop. The rebels are no longer rebels. They are countrymen again. And he sends actually about 60,000 rations through the lines because for the last 3 or 4 days, the Confederates have had really nothing to eat. And so it's the first gesture that he does after the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. And Lee tells his men to go home, even though Jefferson Davis, the president, wanted him to break up the army and send them up into the hills and basically fight a guerrilla war for the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. He does not do that. So finally, the results of the war are this. Anywhere from 600,000 to 700,000. You might even see higher estimates. That's 2% of the population, folks. That means if that occurred today, you'd have anywhere from 22 to 24 million Americans dead within 4 years. The Union, of course, has triumphed over the Confederate States. The federal government has gained power and control, and most, of course, Lincoln gets the idea of the exalted point of almost Washington because he has now brought the country back together from the brink of dissolution. So there we end our discussions of the Civil War.